So how much change can we expect with John Hynes now the bench boss for the Minnesota Wild? Plus, are we going to get better results? At the end of the day, until the Minnesota Wild are willing to admit the thing that will probably help them the most, we're probably going to see more of what we have seen so far. We'll talk about all that and more on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, this is Brandon Duham, and this is Locked on Wild.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any of our new content throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Sleeper. You can download the Sleeper app and use promo code LOCKEDONNHL to get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. See Sleeper's terms of use for details. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we continue our reaction to Dean Evason being fired yesterday. We'll take a look at some of the things that John Hynes had to say in his introductory press conference, as well as a continued push for the postseason, which is probably not the thing that is going to ultimately help this Wild team out the most. We'll talk about all that, and we'll take a little peek at tonight's matchup against the St. Louis Blues as well. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and as you can hear and probably see, still under the weather, still fighting through it, but we still have a lot to talk about here over the course of the rest of this week and into the rest of this season, because it is full steam ahead for this Minnesota Wild team. Bill Guerin saying as much at the John Hynes press conference, saying so in his interview on KFan with Dan Barrero earlier today. It is playoffs for this Minnesota Wild team. He still believes in the mix of players that he has put together for this team, and believes that a jump start by having a fresh voice that is going to bring a fresh set of expectations and a fresh way of doing things is just what the doctor ordered for this Minnesota Wild franchise. I'll be honest with you. I feel no better about the situation today than I did yesterday, because we continue to run from the, I think, biggest thing that needs to be acknowledged by this Minnesota Wild team is that it's the roster. It is this roster that has led to this team getting to this point right now, which is second fewest wins in the NHL, trailing only the San Jose Sharks, who are starting to pick up their performance as well. And it is in several key areas of this roster being constructed that have led to these issues continuing to crop up. And so to just say that the team needs to play better and that Bill Guerin is confident that they will shows you really kind of where we're at with this situation, is that Bill Guerin has played the only card that he had left by bringing John Hynes in as a new coach, because he is telling Craig Leipold, okay, we're going to bring a new coach in. He's going to be able to get through to these players in a different way and be able to get this team performing back to where they were 2 years ago, last year. It's a new coach. And when let's say that things do improve and that this team goes on a nice run and they get themselves into the playoff picture, Guerin is going to go to Craig Leipold and say, see, I told you so. Told you it was just the coach that was the missing piece for what was going wrong with this team. But you can look up and down the lineup, and it is a team that is built off of an idea that 2021, 2022 is attainable multiple times, as opposed to the train of thought that it should have been, which was that 2021, 2022 was essentially the best case scenario. And over the last couple of seasons, we have seen a lot of these issues that are cropping up right now that were just masked in a couple of different ways. 2 years ago, the offense was fantastic. The goaltending was okay. And the special teams, the power play got off to a abysmally bad start and was able to pick it up near the end of the season, but the special teams were still bad. The penalty kill wasn't enough to tank games 2 seasons ago because the offense was as good as it was. And then you get to the postseason and the St. Louis Blues go to the power play a ton of times. They have a ton of opportunities on the power play. They end up capitalizing on them, and they get better goaltending than the Wild do. So the offense masks the flaws in those instances. Last year, you see a regression, which was expected by a lot of the different pieces on that offense who achieved career highs, but not something that was sustainable. You see a plummet in the offense, and also offloading Kevin Fiala to take further away from that offensive production. But you see that masked, and you see the penalty kill masked again because you had stellar goaltending. You had some of the best goaltending in the NHL. And again, that not necessarily sustainable, but you double down on it. You keep the roster exactly the same with the exception of a couple of players in, a couple of players out. And now we are seeing that the offense is at a similar level to where it was last year. The defense with a bit of a regression, and the goaltending with a regression to where now you can't mask the special teams issues, and the defense is not able to overcome for the shortcomings of the goaltending. And so we have, in 2 seasons since 2021, 2022, we have seen a doubling and a tripling down on a season which we continue to say was probably the best case scenario and is not something that's super sustainable. And Bill Guerin has thrown money and years and trade protection at every portion of that group, as opposed to simply saying, okay, if you want to be here, then prove it. Play like you were previously, and then we'll talk about an extension. And so we are getting to this point where you just have locked in this roster that was never going to be able to live up to what they did 2 seasons ago. And the only thing that continues to happen is more and more players continue to regress to what they actually are. And everybody gets a year older and a year older after that. And so now there isn't a ton you can do to try to fix what's going on, short of a bunch of players on this team getting back to where they were in 2021, 2022, which is that just was never sustainable. And we built an entire roster off of 1 year and good goaltending the next. And so I just got to level with everybody listening, and there have been a ton of comments over the last couple of days, but I just got to level with people. I really am no more confident today in where this team is going than where we were at yesterday. You know, we talked about it with Alex in that I just feel like this team continues to cling to that season 2 years ago and now has really no direction as to what's going on moving forward other than just we have to get to the postseason. What else are you building towards? What are you doing to try to ensure that your postseason run is sustainable as opposed to just getting there and then having nothing left in the tank and losing in the first round and going home? And so I think, as a lot of other shows have said, and a lot of other people have said before me, I think it's time that you need to take a real long, hard look at where things are at with this roster, with this franchise. It's not a word that Craig Leipold holds in his vocabulary, and it's a phrase that Bill Guerin has shot down considerably here over the last 24 hours. But I think it's the thing that you just continue to run from that you are inevitably going to need to do. How did the Tampa Bay Lightning get to the top of the mountain? Well, it's because they were willing to go to the depths long enough to get Steven Stamkos and Andre Vasilevsky. How did the Colorado Avalanche get to the top of the mountain? Well, it's because they were willing to wade into the muck and be bad enough to draft the likes of Cale Makar and Nathan MacKinnon. It's not an end-all, be-all. There are plenty of teams, the Edmonton Oilers for one, who have tons of upper echelon talent. And you've got two of maybe the top 5 players in the NHL, and look at how that's worked for them. It's not an end-all, be-all, but there is not one of those players on this roster. Kirill Kaprizov is the closest that the Wild have to a franchise cornerstone, and somebody that when the going gets tough is going to just step up and is going to do what is necessary to turn things around. And it is a core that is built off of being able to do it for one regular season. And then in the postseason, they were just pushed off the face of the earth after getting up 2-1. So I'm wading through this, still frustrated by kind of where we're at. And for those that are hoping that we're going to see some sweeping changes with John Hynes being introduced, well, you may need to kind of dial that back as well. We'll talk a little more about what John Hynes brings to the table and why it's probably not going to look much different with where the Wild are at now compared to with Hynes as the coach. We'll talk about all that and more as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Sleeper. A new NHL season brings all sorts of possibilities, whether it be Marco Rossi netting a goal, the Minnesota Wild eventually winning the Stanley Cup. You could win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick whether elite players like Connor McDavid, Alex Ovechkin, Sidney Crosby, or Nathan MacKinnon will record more or less than their sleeper projections for things like goals, assists, saves, plus, minus, and more in a given game. It is so easy. You can make your selections in less than a minute, and you can also play daily fantasy NFL, NBA, MLB, and college football on Sleeper. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL, and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, you may have noticed that we have switched to live premieres once again, and that is because Locked On has created the first ever 24/7 national sports streaming channel on YouTube. Locked On Sports Today is here for you, covering 24/7 the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Go to Locked On Sports Today on YouTube and subscribe to the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel. So what is John Hynes going to bring to the Minnesota Wild? Well, you heard it in the press conference today with Bill Guerin, is that he wasn't brought in to make major sweeping changes. And I think in addition to their previous history, I think that's why John Hynes was the guy, is because Bill Guerin still believes that this team is capable of being a factor in the postseason conversation based off of the style that they play, the structure that they play, what they bring to the ice. And so he's bringing somebody in who can do all of that just in maybe a slightly different way. The Athletic had a great breakdown as to what John Hynes brings to the table, and his defensive philosophy in particular shifts defensive coverage to more of the high danger areas while you're out there on the ice. Well, guess what? Statistically, the Minnesota Wild have actually not been as bad defensively in the high danger areas as they have, in the last couple of seasons. They've been better in defending those areas over the course of this season. It's just the goalies have not been able to make the saves. And the Athletic further discusses that the push to continue to turn this team into we have to prevent the other team from scoring does not address the biggest issue with this team is their lack of speed and their lack of skill. And so John Hynes is not going to be somebody that can help in those areas because that is a roster problem. And that is what we have seen over the last 2 years is a continued push for more size, for more grit, and less from the speed and the skill variety. I thought it was interesting in talking to Nick Morgan yesterday for the recording of the Locked On NHL show that aired today, in talking about how the Predators teams that Hynes was the coach of had a handful of players that were the ones that were widely counted on and had one season in which a bunch of them just went off and had a ton of goals. And that was oddly familiar to what we have seen from this Minnesota Wild team over the last couple of seasons. A team in which you have a handful of players. For Nashville, who's Roman Josi for one, a handful of players who can get the offense rolling and a bunch of guys that just really aren't capable of doing it. And so, again, that's not something that John Hynes is going to be able to fix. That is something that is just an issue with how this roster is constructed. And that is something that you're not going to be able to fix this season, next season. That is just who you are at this point. And so, yeah, cool. Make it so that you allow 0 goals per game. If John Hynes gets these goalies figured out and maybe has a different way of kind of motivating them to get back on track, he's going to be successful. Am I rooting for him to be successful here? Absolutely I am. But I just continue to point to the fact that the roster is an issue that is one that you just can't really do anything about. And at some point, and now we are rapidly approaching and have probably already passed that point, at some point you just are what you are. I found it interesting that Bill Guerin was non-committal about the length of the contract for Hynes, but said that it is a multi-year arrangement. And so this is now this situation. Bill Guerin has pushed all of his chips into the middle of the table as John Hynes being the guy that can convince Craig Leipold that the roster isn't the problem, it's the coach. And if that is not the case, there's a high likelihood that that could be how this plays out. If that's not the case, then Bill Guerin's not going to last through the end of these buyouts, which would be a staggering change of events from where we were at even at the beginning of his tenure when he was buying out Zach Parise and Ryan Suter. The fact that he could not make it through, now that would take, I think, a lot of losing, and that would take Craig Leipold making that decision, which anything that you've seen from the fact that Bill Guerin has been elevated to president of hockey operations has been given a length of deal. We have no idea what the length of the deal is. He's got a lot of power into how this roster looks and how this organization operates. And it's not going to be easy for that to be removed. And so the John Hynes era, don't be surprised if it continues with more of what we've seen, because really the only thing that Hynes can do is just find a different way to motivate this team. It's on them to perform. And so it all starts tonight against the St. Louis Blues. And we'll take a little bit of a look at how the Blues have been doing this season, including their probably going to get back on track tonight power play as we continue today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Collective. If you run a solo small business, you're an army of one, but you still need a CPA, bookkeeper, separate payroll solution, and more. Let Collective take care of the paperwork while you take care of business. Collective is the #1 financial solution for freelancers, contractors, and self-employed entrepreneurs that let you focus on your passions, not your paperwork. Let Collective handle all of the paperwork you dread, like corporate formation and compliance taxes, bookkeeping, accounting, and even payroll. The best part? It's at a fraction of the cost of a CPA. Join the thousands of solopreneurs who have saved an average of $10,000 per year on taxes with their structure. Right now, Collective is offering 1 month free and no onboarding fee when you go to collective.com/LockedOnNHL and tell them Locked On NHL sent you. That's a $550 value for free when you go to collective.com/LockedOnNHL and tell them Locked On NHL sent you. That's collective.com/LockedOnNHL. Make sure to tell them Locked On NHL sent you. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wilds. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wilds your first listen each and every day. For the everydayers, we will continue to react to the news of Dean Evason being relieved of his duties. We'll take a look at see if we can notice any sorts of changes in John Hynes' coaching style here in tonight's game against the St. Louis Blues. And we'll have that for you, as well as plenty of other things to get to here throughout the rest of this week. So make sure you subscribe to Locked on Wild on YouTube if you haven't already, and make sure you follow us on your favorite podcast platforms as well. The St. Louis Blues coming to town here tonight. They're 11-8-1 on the season, and they have won 3 out of their last 4. And for this St. Louis Blues team, the biggest thing about facing the Blues is the fact that their power play right now is not in a good spot. You look at the top spot in the entire NHL for power play percentage, it's New Jersey, still at 37.5%. The St. Louis Blues are third to last and one of only 3 teams in the NHL with a power play below 10%. They are at 9.8% right now and have currently scored 6 power play goals. The Minnesota Wild have roughly half of that. It's an offense that doesn't score a ton of goals. They are averaging 2.95 goals per game so far this season. And it is a St. Louis team, ironically, that is the least penalized in the league. And so you're going up against a Minnesota Wild team that is in the top third. Although after what happened between the Ottawa Senators and the Florida Panthers, those two teams vaulted all the way inside the top 10 with their performances from last night's game. The Minnesota Wild with 231 penalty minutes so far this season. St. Louis has 130. So under Craig Berube, it was a rough start for the Blues, but they have got the ship back on track a little bit. And it's a team that has plenty of weapons at their disposal, plenty of players that are capable of taking over the game. Robert Thomas, Pavel Buchnevich, Jordan Kyrou, Braden Shen, Kevin Hayes, who was acquired from the Philadelphia Flyers in the offseason. And then you've got some young players as well who are making an impact in the lineup. And all in all, it is a Blues team that the Wild are quite familiar with over the last few seasons. It starts and it ends with their goaltending. Jordan Binnington in net for the Blues here this evening. And if you look at what Binnington has done so far this season, much like we have seen from him in previous years, he's 6-5-1 right now. He's a 2.89 goals against average and a 909 save percentage. And Binnington seems to be very Jekyll and very Hyde. If you look at his goalie performances, he has 3 starts in which he's given up 5 goals or more. He has another 3 starts in which he's given up 4 goals or more. He also has a handful of starts in which he's given up 2 goals or fewer. So it's pretty hit or miss, it seems, for Jordan Binnington in net. But it doesn't matter who the Minnesota Wild play at this point in the season. The results have been pretty much a carbon copy, just Photoshop different jerseys on the opponents, and you're likely going to get a pretty good idea of what is coming for the 2023-2024 Minnesota Wild. A hard push early, a little bit of a good start for the first couple of minutes, then a long stretch of quiet offensively, which usually leads to the opponent scoring a goal to take a 1-0 lead. More quiet play by the Minnesota Wild, often leading to a second goal for the opponents. Then you get a little bit of a push to maybe get back into it 2-1, 2-2 in some cases. And then you have expounded so much energy just trying to come back from that deficit that then at the end of the game, you got nothing in the tank and the opponent is able to score a goal in the third period or in overtime or in the shootout to be able to come away with the win. And so honestly, what I'm going to do for tonight, what I'm going to give John Hynes the benefit of is not reacting swiftly to whatever we see in this game. There is going to be, hopefully, the one thing that you can, I think, hope to see is urgency from the players on the Minnesota Wild side. Urgency that's now, okay, a coach has been fired. We have to pick it up and we have to figure out how to get this done. So the thing that I'm looking for here tonight is some of that urgency, some of that play like your season ended tomorrow type mentality, because it's not an easy task to have a new coach come in and have a game the same day. Hynes is going to need to take an opportunity to get figured out what is going on. Although you could also look at it from the fact that Bill Guerin potentially gave him some heads up so that he could do a little homework as to what's going on with this team. But assuming he didn't, Hynes needs some time to look at what needs to be fixed and what even can be fixed before we really start to see some improvement. So for these, probably the 2 games this week before the game against Chicago on Sunday, those 2 games, you're probably just looking for some level of urgency from the Wilds. And if you get that, then message received, and okay, you have potentially gotten your push for the playoffs back on track. But again, at the end of the day, it just feels like blaming somebody else for crashing your car. Firing the passenger, like you were driving the car and you wrecked it. You can't blame the passenger because you were the one at the steering wheel. And that just kind of feels like what this is. I hope John Hynes is successful. I don't like to root against people or to put them in kind of a tough spot coming in. But that's the reality of the situation, is that this roster is flawed and it's a team that is better than how they've played. Certainly. They certainly are better than how they've played so far this year. But they're not ever going to get to 2021, 2022 again. We just have to accept that that's how that plays out. They're not going to be that team ever again. And the sooner that Bill Guerin realizes that, the sooner he has the opportunity to try to make sure that he isn't the next one out the door. So that's what we got for you here for today for our episode of Locked On Wild. We appreciate everybody for tuning in each and every day, whether I feel 100% or 15 in today's case. We still have content for you. We're still going to break news for you. We're still going to have all of the reaction to everything going on with this team. And so make sure to stay with us and subscribe so you don't miss out on any Minnesota Wild news or game recaps here at Locked On Wild. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.